Hello, everybody. It's Paul Nison with Torah Life Ministries. We are going live for a live Bible reading, a daily live Bible reading. We are up to a new book. We are up to the book of Esther. So thank you for joining me here for this book. Let's open up with the Shema found in Deuteronomy 6:4-9. Shema Israel, Yahweh Eloheinu, Yahweh Echad, Baruch Shem Kevo, Mahutov, Leolam Vaed. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is your Elohim, Yahweh is one. Blessed is the name of his glorious kingdom for all eternity. And you shall love Yahweh your Elohim with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And have these words which I command you this day be upon your heart. And you shall teach them diligently to your children, and speak of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you retire, and when you arise. And you shall bind them for a sign upon your hand, and let them be frontlets between your eyes. And you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and upon your gates. Amen. Amen. So we are reading this book of Esther right now. It's a wonderful book, and we're going to see what it's about here. And it says, the book of Esther begins with Queen Vashti refusing to obey an order from her husband, King Xerxes. She was secretly banished, and the search began for a new queen. The king sent a decree to gather together all the beautiful young women in the empire to bring them into the royal harem. Esther, a young Jewish woman, was one of those chosen. King Xerxes was so pleased with Esther that he made her his queen. So that's where we find ourselves right now. Let me get this here. Okay, so the purpose of this book, Esther, was to just demonstrate Yahweh's sovereignty and his loving care for his people. The author was unknown, possibly Mordecai, and some have suggested Ezra or Nehemiah because of the similarity of the writing style. The original audience was the people of Israel, and it was written approximately 470 BC. Esther became queen in 479. And the blueprint we see in the first two chapters is Esther becoming the queen. And it says here, the book of Esther is an example of Yahweh's divine guidance and care of our lives. Then in the second and the third and fourth chapters are about the Jewish people that were threatened. And it says, Yahweh's sovereignty and power are seen throughout this book. Although we may question certain circumstances in our lives, we must have faith that Yahweh is in control, working through both the pleasant and the difficult times so that we can serve him efficiently. And then in chapters 5-8, we see Esther interceding for the Jewish people. And then in chapter 4, the Jewish people are delivered. So that is Esther. We're going to read chapter 1 right now. And verse 1, it says, let's see. Let's come here. These events happened in the days of King Xerxes, who reigned over 127 provinces stretching from India to Ethiopia. So right in verse 1, we have a lot of notes here. First, we see Angastius, the spelling of his Persian name, reigned from 3392 to 3413 on the Jewish calendar. That is 485 to 464 BC. His name is Greek was Xerxes. And it says here, Esther's story begins in 483 BC, 103 years after Nebuchadnezzar has taken the Jewish people into captivity. 54 years after Zebulun led his first group of exiles back to Jerusalem, and 35 years before Ezra and the second group to Jerusalem. Esther lived in the kingdom of Persia, a dominant kingdom in the Middle East after Babylon's fall in 539 BC. Esther's parents must have been among these exiles who chose not to return to Jerusalem, even though Cyrus, the Persian king, had issued a new decree allowing them to do so. The Jewish exiles had great freedom in Persia, and many remained because they had established themselves there or were fearful of the dangerous journey back to their homeland. Xerxes the Greek, the Great, was Persia's fifth king. He was proud and impulsive, as we see from the events in chapter 1. His winter palace was in Susa, where he held the banquet described in chapter 1, verses 3 to 7. Persian kings often had great banquets before going to war. In 1481, Xerxes launched an attack against Greece. After his fleet won a great victory at Thermopylae, he was defeated at Salamis in 480 and had to return to Persia. Esther became queen in 479. So it says here in verse, so that's for verse 1. So now for verse 2 we read, it says in verse 2, at the time Xerxes ruled his empire from his royal throne at the fortress of Susa. And it says, in the context, the fortress means the palace. So it meant the palace. And it says, this palace has been dug up in modern times, with the women's quarters found in the northwest portion. Wow. So archaeologists has found this palace. That's really amazing. Just really, that's astonishing. So verse 3 reads, in his third year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his noble and officers. He invited all the military officers of Persia and Media, as well as the princes and nobles of all the provinces. The celebration lasted 180 days, a tremendous display of the opulent wealth of his empire and the pomp and splendor of his majesty. Wow, 180 days. The note here says the celebration lasted 180 days, about 6 months, because his real purpose was to plan the battle strategy for invading Greece, and to demonstrate that the king had sufficient wealth to carry it out. Waging war was not only for survival; it was a means of acquiring more wealth and territory and power. So that's the note there for that. And we read verse 5. When it was all over, the king gave a banquet for all the people, from the greatest to the least, who were in the fortress of Susa. It lasted for 7 days and was held in the courtyard of the palace garden. The courtyard was beautifully decorated with white cotton curtains and blue hangings, which were fastened with white linen cords, and the purple ribbons to silver rings embroidered with marble pillars. Gold and silver couches stood on a mosaic pavement of marble, of fortified marble, a mother of pearl, and other costly stones. So this was a very beautiful building here, and it says in a note, these were couches on which the diners reclined to eat, sitting on couches made of gold and silver. Wow. And so the note here says, Persia was a world power, and the king, as the center of the power, was one of the wealthiest people in the world. Persian kings loved to flaunt their wealth, even wearing precious gemstones in their beards. Jewelry was a sign of rank in Persia. Even soldiers wore great amounts of gold jewelry into battle. Very interesting notes there. So, we see here, verse 7. Drinks was served in gold goblets of many designs, and there was an abundance of royal wine reflecting the king's generosity. By edict of the king, no limits were placed on the drinking, for the king had instructed all his palace officials to serve each man as much as he wanted. And then verse 9 goes to read, at the same time, Queen Vashti gave her a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. And it says here in the note, it says, Ancient Greek documents call Xerxes' wife Amethyst, properly a Greek form of Vashti. Vashti was disposed in 483 and 482 BC, but she mentioned again in ancient records as a queen mother during the reign of her son uh, Altraches, who succeeded Xerxes towards the end of Xerxes' reign. Either Esther died or Vashti was able through her son to reign and influence she had lost. A nice, interesting note there. And verse 10. On the seventh day of the feast, which King Xerxes was in high spirits because of the wine, he told 7 eunuchs who attended him, Marnim, Belza, Hobrazah, Betha, Aletha, Susa, and Carcas, to bring Queen Vashti to him with the royal crown on her head. With the royal crown on her head, he wanted the nobles and the other men to gaze on her beauty. She was a very beautiful woman. And the note here says some advisors and government officials were castrated in order to prevent them from having children and them rebelling and trying to establish a dynasty over their own. A castrated official was called a eunuch. And this is very common, and I speak of this all throughout Egypt, ancient Egypt, and other areas. It's not unique to this book here. It says Xerxes made a rash half-drink decision based on purely of feelings. His self-restraint and practical wisdom were weakened by too much wine. Poor decisions are made when people don't think clearly. Base your decisions on careful thinking, not on emotions and the moment. Impulse decision making leads to severe consequence or complications. And verse 12. But when they conveyed the king's orders to Queen Vashti, she refused to come. This made the king furious, and he burned with anger. Well, the note here in the One New Bible, verse 11 says, commentators say that the king was drunk, ordering Vashti to wear only the crown, to appear nude for all the men to see her beauty. So that's definitely a twist you might have heard from the story, but it was the same idea. They wanted her to show up, whether it was however she was dressed or not dressed. He wanted to flaunt her beauty, and she didn't want any part of that, right? So it says Queen Vashti refused to parade before the king's all-male party, possibly because it was against Persian custom for a woman to appear before a public gathering of men. This conflict between Persian custom and the king's command put her in a difficult situation, and she chose to refuse her half-drunk husband, hoping he would come to his senses later. Some have suggested that Vashti was pregnant with Artaxerxes, who was born in 483 BC, and that she did not want to be seen in public in that state. Whatever the reason, her action was a breach of protocol and also placed Xerxes in a difficult situation. Once he made the command as a Persian king, he could not reverse it. While preparing to invade Greece, Xerxes had invited important officials from all over his land to see his power, wealth, and authority. If it was perceived that if he had authority over if he didn't have authority over his own wife, his military credibility would be damaged. And the greatest critics of success for an ancient king. In addition, King Xerxes was accustomed to getting what he wanted. So these are some of the insights of why what happened at the time and what they were dealing with and going through. So we read here verse 12. But when they conveyed the king's order to the queen Vashti, she refused to come, and this made the king furious, and he burned with anger. He immediately consulted with his wise advisors, who knew all the Persian laws and customs, for he always asked for their advice. That's verse 13. Verse 14. The names of these men were Kasra, Sheta, Amitha, Tesha, Xerxes, and Mersken, 7 nobles of Persia and Media. They met with the king regularly and held the highest positions in the empire. What must be done to Queen Vashti? The king demanded. What penalty does the law provide for a queen who refused to obey the king's orders, promptly sent through his eunuchs? Now, the note here says, for 13 and 15, Xerxes, like most leaders in the past and present, kept a handful of advisors who consulted on almost all matters. Often the king's success fell on the wisdom of these men. Daniel was such an advisor under Darius and Cyrus. And then it says, Middle Eastern kings often did not have close personal relationships with their wives. Xerxes demonstrates this because he had no harem. He showed no respect for Vashti's priesthood. And Esther, when she became queen, did not see him for long periods of time. Then we read verse 16. Verse 16. Macklin answered the king and his nobles. Queen Vashti has wronged not only the king, but also every noble and citizen throughout your empire. Women everywhere will begin to despise their husbands when they learn that Queen Vashti had refused to appear before the king. And verse 18, before this day is out, the wives of all the king's nobles throughout Persia and Media will hear what the queen did and will start treating their husbands the same way. There will be no end to the contempt of his anger. So if it please the king, we suggest that you issue a written decree, a law the Persians and Medes cannot be revoked. It should order that the Queen Vashti be forever banished from the presence of King Xerxes, and that the king should choose another queen more worthy than she. When the decree is published throughout the king's vast empire, husbands everywhere, whatever their rank, will receive proper respect from their wives. I think this is a good advice under a bad situation. So let's read here. It says in the note, perhaps the men's thinking had been clouded by drinking. Obviously, the war would not cause the women of the country to respect their husbands. Respect between men and women comes from mutual regard and appreciation for each at those created in Yahweh's image, not from legal pronouncements and orders. Forced obedience is a poor substitute for the love and respect wives and husbands should have for each other. And it says here for verse 17 in the One New Bible, except among the Jewish and the martial societies, women were caddis, property of their husbands. That's what it says there. And for verse 19 in the Hebraic root scripture, it says, Vashti's lack of judicial order lost her the kingdom. So you see other translations go into more notes than others. That's why we read both. And then finally, there's a note for 19. It says, a Persian king was thought to be a god by many of his people. Therefore, when he issued a law or command, it stood forever. The law could never be canceled, even if it was ill-advised. But if necessary, a new law could be issued to neutralize the effects of the old law. Now, we're going to see later why that matters and why that's important. But let's continue to read here. Verse 19. So if it please the king, we suggest that you issue a written decree, a law to the Persians and Medes that cannot be revoked. It should order that Queen Vashti be forever banished from the presence of the king Xerxes, and that the king should choose another queen more worthy than she. When this decree is published throughout the king's vast empire, husbands everywhere, whatever their rank, will receive the proper respect from their wives. In verse 21, the king and his nobles thought this made good sense, so he followed Merson's counsel. He sent letters to all parts of the empire, to each province in its own script and language, proclaiming that every man should be the ruler of his own home and should say whatever he pleases. All right, so that was our reading for today for Esther, for the first part of Esther chapter 1. And we can close up this morning with the Aaronic benediction and our blessings to you all today. So we do this number 624 to 26. Yerifkika, Yahweh, Vivishmarikika, Yo Yahweh Panana Alaka Vikunika. Yo see Yahweh Panana Alaka Yasemaka Shalom. Yahweh bless you and keep you. Yahweh make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. Yahweh lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen. Amen. All right, everybody, have a blessed day out there today. Yahweh be with you, and please share this with others, and shalom, shalom.